Doctor had worked at Metropolitan General Hospital for 12 years, but he had never paid much attention to Sarah Williams. She was just another nurse on the night shift, quiet and efficient, always completing her rounds without fuss. At 32, Sarah moved through the cardiac ward with a gentle grace that put patients at ease. Her auburn hair was always neatly pulled back, and she wore the same calm expression whether dealing with a worried family member or a difficult patient. Often wondered how someone could be so unremarkable yet so reliable. Sarah never complained about overtime, never gossiped in the break room, and never seemed to have a life outside the hospital. She arrived precisely at 7 in the evening and left at 7 in the morning, like clockwork. The other nurses respected her, but none seemed to know much about her personal life. The cardiac ward occupied the entire 15th floor of the 40-story building. It housed 60 beds, mostly filled with elderly patients recovering from heart surgery or managing chronic conditions. The atmosphere was usually peaceful, with soft beeping from monitors and the quiet shuffle of medical staff making their rounds. Sarah knew every patient by name, remembered their preferences, and somehow always appeared at their bedside exactly when they needed something. On this particular Thursday evening in November, the ward felt different. Couldn't shake an uneasy feeling that had been growing throughout his shift. 3 new patients had been admitted that afternoon, all claiming to be transfer cases from other hospitals. Something about their paperwork didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. The men seemed too alert, too aware of their surroundings for people supposedly recovering from serious cardiac events. Sarah had noticed it too, caught her studying the new patients' charts with an intensity he'd never seen before. When their eyes met across the nurse's station, she quickly looked away and returned to her work. But for just a moment, he had glimpsed something sharp and calculating in her expression that was completely unlike the gentle nurse he thought he knew. The evening progressed normally until around 10 o'clock. Was reviewing lab results when he heard the elevator chime. He glanced up to see 6 men in hospital scrubs stepping onto the ward. They moved with a purpose that immediately raised alarm bells in his mind. Real hospital staff didn't walk with that kind of coordinated precision. Before could react, the men spread out across the ward with military efficiency. 1 headed toward the medication storage room, 2 moved toward the patient rooms where the most vulnerable residents lay sleeping, and 3 positioned themselves near the exits. The man who appeared to be their leader pulled something from beneath his scrubs that made blood freeze, a compact gun. The realization hit like a physical blow. This wasn't a random attack. These people had specifically targeted the cardiac ward, probably because it housed some of the hospital's wealthiest and most influential patients. The ward was also isolated on the 15th floor, making it easy to control access and difficult for help to arrive quickly. Panic began to spread among the few family members who were visiting late. An elderly woman screamed when she saw the weapon. A man tried to run toward the stairwell but found his path blocked by one of the intruders. The attackers began shouting orders, demanding that everyone move to the center of the ward where they could be easily watched. Felt his medical training kick in even as his hands shook with adrenaline. His first thought was for his patients. Many of them were in critical condition and couldn't be moved without risking their lives. The stress of this situation alone could trigger heart attacks in several of the more vulnerable individuals. That's when he noticed Sarah's reaction. Instead of the fear he expected to see on her face, she had gone completely still. Her eyes were moving systematically across the ward, cataloging positions and distances with the precision of someone conducting a tactical assessment. Her breathing had become slow and controlled, and her hands hung loosely at her sides in a way that somehow managed to look both relaxed and ready. One of the attackers, a tall man with hands, approached the nurse's station where Sarah stood. He pointed his weapon at her and barked an order to gather all the patient medications. Sarah nodded submissively and began moving toward the medication room, but noticed something strange. Her shuffling, frightened walk was completely different from her usual confident stride. She was acting. As Sarah passed near a supply cart, her hand briefly touched something among the medical instruments. The movement was so quick and natural that almost missed it. When the attacker's attention turned to threaten a crying family member, Sarah's eyes met again. This time he saw no trace of the gentle nurse he knew. Instead, he was looking into the eyes of someone who had seen violence before and was prepared to meet it head-on. The leader of the attackers began explaining their demands to the terrified group. They wanted access to the hospital's pharmaceutical storage, the patient records of several high-profile individuals, and safe passage out of the building. They claimed to have explosives planted throughout the hospital and threatened to detonate them if their demands weren't met within 1 hour. Felt sick as he realized the scope of the threat. These weren't desperate criminals making impulsive choices. They were professionals executing a carefully planned operation. They knew exactly which patients were on the ward, how the hospital's security systems worked, and where the most valuable resources were stored. But as he watched Sarah continue her seemingly cooperative behavior while subtly positioning herself near key points around the ward, began to understand that the attackers had made one critical miscalculation. They had dismissed the quiet nurse as a non-threat, just as he had done for 12 years. Now he was starting to suspect that Sarah Williams might be the most dangerous person in the room. The first sign of her true nature came when one of the attackers roughly grabbed an elderly patient who was trying to return to his bed. The man had just major heart surgery and was barely able to stand. As the attacker raised his hand to strike the confused patient, Sarah moved. Her intervention appeared completely accidental. She stumbled while carrying a tray of medications, accidentally bumping into the attacker just as he was about to hit the elderly man. The collision sent both of them off balance, but somehow Sarah managed to regain her footing first. As she helped the attacker steady himself, apologizing profusely, saw her hand briefly touch the man's neck. The attacker brushed off her apologies and returned to his position, apparently unaware that anything significant had happened. But was watching carefully now, and he noticed that the man began moving more slowly. His reactions seemed delayed, and he kept shaking his head as if trying to clear it. Sarah had done something during that brief contact, something that was affecting his motor functions without being immediately obvious. The realization sent a chill down spine. Sarah had just demonstrated knowledge of pressure points and nerve manipulation that went far beyond anything taught in nursing school. She had disabled an armed attacker using techniques that required extensive specialized training. The question was, what kind of training did a cardiac nurse possess that would teach her such skills? As the hour deadline approached and the attackers became more agitated, found himself watching Sarah with a mixture of fear and fascination. She continued to play her role perfectly, appearing frightened and compliant while systematically positioning herself for something that he was beginning to understand would be far more dangerous than anything the attackers were expecting. The transformation began so subtly that almost missed it. Sarah had been asked to check on a patient in room 1523, one of the elderly women who had been crying since the attack began. As Sarah approached the room, the attacker guarding that section followed her inside, keeping his weapon trained on both women. Through the glass partition, watched as Sarah appeared to comfort the patient, adjusting her blankets and checking her IV line. What happened next, everything thought he knew about physics and human capability. The attacker had positioned himself near the foot of the bed, confident that he had complete control of the situation. Sarah was speaking quietly to the patient, her back turned to the gunman, when she suddenly spun around with fluid precision that belonged in a martial arts demonstration, not a hospital room. Her movement was a blur of calculated violence. One hand struck the attacker's wrist with surgical precision, causing his weapon to fly across the room. Before he could react, her other hand connected with a point on his neck that instantly dropped him to the floor, unconscious but still breathing. The entire encounter lasted less than 3 seconds and made virtually no noise. Stared in shock as Sarah quickly secured the weapon and checked the man's pulse. Her movements were methodical and professional, like someone who had performed this exact sequence many times before. She then did something that made blood run cold. She spoke into what appeared to be a small communication device hidden beneath her uniform. "Control, this is Nightingale," she whispered, using a voice that was completely different from her usual gentle tone. "Package is compromised. Initiating Protocol 7. 15 hostiles confirmed, civilian count at 43. Request immediate backup to floor 15. The response came through so quietly that could barely hear it, but Sarah's expression grew more intense as she listened. She nodded once and then began moving with purpose that transformed her from the quiet nurse into something entirely different. Every gesture was economical and deadly. Every glance calculated the tactical advantage of her position. Realized with growing amazement that Sarah wasn't just some nurse with unusual skills. She was a trained operative who had been placed in the hospital for reasons he couldn't begin to guess. The way she moved, the professional terminology she used, and the ease with which she had disabled a trained attacker all pointed to military or intelligence background at the highest level. But there was no time to process this revelation fully. The leader of the attackers had noticed that his man hadn't returned from the patient room. He sent 2 more men to investigate while keeping his weapon trained on the group of civilians huddled in the center of the ward. Sarah had anticipated this. As the 2 men approached room 1523, she had already positioned herself in the adjacent supply closet, watched in fascination as she emerged behind them like a ghost. The first man never knew what hit him, a precise strike to the base of his skull that dropped him instantly. The second man had time to turn around, but Sarah was already moving. Her combat style was unlike anything had ever seen, even in movies. She flowed around the man's attempts to bring his weapon to bear, using his own momentum against him. A strike to his elbow rendered his arm useless. A sweep of her leg sent him crashing into the wall. By the time he hit the ground, Sarah was already securing his weapon and ensuring he wouldn't be getting back up anytime soon. 3 attackers down, and the main group still hadn't realized what was happening. Sarah's ability to work silently and efficiently was beyond impressive. It was supernatural. She moved through the shadows of the ward like death itself, picking off the attackers one by one without alerting the others. The 4th attacker was positioned near the medication storage room, exactly where Sarah needed to go. Watched as she approached him using the blind spots created by medical equipment and patient beds. When she was close enough, she used a technique that involved pressure points along his spine. The man simply collapsed as if his strings had been cut, alive but completely incapacitated. By now was beginning to understand the scope of what he was witnessing. Sarah wasn't just neutralizing threats. She was systematically dismantling a professional operation using skills that suggested years of specialized training. Her knowledge of human anatomy, combined with her combat expertise, made her devastatingly effective in close-quarters situations. The 5th and 6th attackers were taken down using medical equipment in ways that would never appear in any nursing manual. A modified defibrillator delivered precise electrical shocks that disabled without killing. Surgical tubing became restraints that could render someone unconscious through carefully applied pressure. Even common medical supplies became weapons in Sarah's hands. Found himself both terrified and amazed as he watched this transformation. The gentle nurse who had brought him coffee during countless night shifts was systematically working her way through a team of professional killers with an efficiency that belonged in a special forces operation, not a cardiac ward. But the most impressive display was yet to come. The leader of the attackers had finally realized that his team was being eliminated. He began shouting orders and firing his weapon into the ceiling to frighten the civilians. His remaining men spread out across the ward, making Sarah's job exponentially more difficult. This is when Sarah revealed the true extent of her capabilities. Instead of continuing her stealth approach, she stepped into the open and faced the remaining attackers directly. Counted 9 men still standing, all armed and now fully alert to the threat she represented. What followed was a master class in combat efficiency. Sarah moved through the ward like a force of nature, using everything from IV poles to oxygen tanks as weapons. She turned the familiar environment of the hospital into a tactical advantage, knowing exactly how each piece of equipment could be used both defensively and offensively. A wheeled cart became a shield that she used to close distance while deflecting gunfire. The attacker tried to reload, but Sarah was already inside his guard, using a technique that involved his own weapon against him. The gun became a leverage point that allowed her to flip him over her shoulder and into a medication cabinet with enough force to ensure he wouldn't be getting back up. Another attacker attempted to use a patient as a human shield, but Sarah had anticipated this move. She used the hospital's sprinkler system, triggering it manually to create chaos and confusion. In the resulting spray of water and limited visibility, she moved like a predator through familiar territory. The attacker found himself disarmed and unconscious before he could comprehend how Sarah had reached him through what should have been an impenetrable defense. Watched in growing amazement as Sarah continued her systematic elimination of the remaining threats. Each takedown was different, adapted to the specific situation and terrain. She used medical oxygen to create a temporary blinding cloud, allowing her to approach another attacker undetected. A surgical laser became a precision tool for disabling electronic equipment that the attackers were using to coordinate their movements. The most spectacular moment came when three of the remaining attackers tried to corner her near the main nurse's station. Sarah used the multi-level layout of the medical equipment to her advantage, moving vertically as well as horizontally to avoid their combined firepower. She swung from an overhead surgical light fixture, kicked off a medical monitor, and landed behind them with enough momentum to take down two of the men simultaneously. The third attacker had enough time to bring his weapon around, but Sarah was already moving. She used his own teammate's body as a launching point, propelling herself forward with enough force to deliver a strike that ended the encounter before he could pull the trigger. As the number of active threats decreased, began to see the broader pattern of Sarah's strategy. She wasn't just reacting to situations as they developed. She had been orchestrating the entire encounter from the beginning. Every movement, every position she had taken during the initial phase of the attack had been preparation for this moment. The remaining three attackers, including their leader, had barricaded themselves near the main entrance to the ward. They were using the civilian hostages as shields while trying to call for backup on their communication devices. But Sarah had anticipated this as well. During her systematic elimination of their teammates, she had also been disabling their electronic equipment using techniques that seemed to involve electromagnetic pulse devices hidden throughout her medical equipment. Realized that Sarah's placement on the cardiac ward hadn't been coincidental. She had been specifically positioned here because someone had anticipated that this facility would eventually be targeted. Her entire identity as a quiet, unremarkable nurse had been an elaborate cover for what was obviously a highly sophisticated security operation. The final confrontation began when the leader of the attackers realized the true scope of what had happened to his team. Standing behind a barricade of overturned gurneys with his two remaining men, he held a device that recognized with horror as a detonator. The terrorist's eyes were wild with rage and desperation as he shouted threats about the explosives he claimed were planted throughout the hospital. Sarah stood 30 feet away, completely calm despite being surrounded by the aftermath of the battle she had single-handedly won. Her nursing uniform was torn and stained, but her breathing remained steady and controlled. In her hands, she held what appeared to be a standard medical tablet, but could see additional modifications that suggested it was far more sophisticated than normal hospital equipment. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," the leader screamed, his voice echoing through the ward. "I can bring down this entire building with the push of a button. Everyone dies unless you back away and let us leave." Sarah's response came in the same gentle voice that had heard her use with confused patients for 12 years. "My name is Agent Sarah Williams, and I've been protecting this facility for the past 3 years. The explosives you're referring to were disabled 47 minutes ago by my tactical team. Your backup has been intercepted. Your escape routes have been sealed. You have 2 choices: surrender now or force me to make the choice for you." The leader's face twisted with fury as he realized that his carefully planned operation had been anticipated from the beginning. "Impossible! We had inside information. We knew exactly when the security rotations changed, exactly which patients would be here tonight. Someone on the inside was feeding us intelligence." Sarah nodded slowly and saw something cold and calculating in her expression. "Yes, someone was feeding you intelligence, but they were working for us, not you. Every piece of information you received was carefully crafted to bring you here tonight when we were ready for you." The full scope of the operation began to dawn on. Sarah hadn't just been stationed at the hospital to protect it. She had been part of an elaborate trap designed to capture this specific group of terrorists. Everything from the patient roster to the security arrangements had been carefully orchestrated to make the cardiac ward appear vulnerable when it was actually the most protected location in the entire building. "The 3 patients you admitted this afternoon," Sarah continued, her voice taking on an edge that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice when your advanced team tried to conduct reconnaissance from inside the facility? They've been in our custody since this morning. They provided very useful information about your operational methods." One of the remaining attackers, a younger man who was clearly losing his nerve, started to lower his weapon. His leader immediately screamed at him to maintain position, but could see that the psychological warfare was taking its toll. These men had thought they were executing a carefully planned attack on a soft target. Instead, they had walked into a trap that had been months in the making. Sarah began moving forward slowly, her hands visible and empty, but could see that she was positioning herself for something. Every step was calculated to reduce the distance between herself and the barricaded terrorists, while simultaneously moving her closer to specific pieces of medical equipment that she had apparently been planning to use. "The pharmaceutical storage you were targeting," Sarah said as she continued her approach, "has been empty for 2 weeks. The patient records you wanted were fabricated. The wealthy targets you thought you were going to kidnap or hold for ransom are actually federal agents posing as cardiac patients. You never had any chance of success because this entire scenario was designed specifically to capture you and your organization." The leader's hand tightened on the detonator, but his confidence was clearly shaken. Realized that Sarah was using psychological tactics that were just as sophisticated as her physical combat skills. She was systematically destroying their morale and confidence while simultaneously maneuvering herself into position for a final assault. "You want to know the truth?" Sarah's voice became almost conversational, as if she were discussing treatment options with a difficult patient's family. "My real name is Sarah, former Navy SEAL, current deep cover operative for the Strategic Hospital Defense Initiative. For the past 3 years, I've been living the life of a cardiac nurse while my team tracked your organization's activities. We knew you would eventually target this facility, because we made sure the intelligence you received pointed you directly here." Felt his world shift as he realized that nothing about Sarah's identity had been real. The quiet, reliable nurse who had worked alongside him for years was actually an elite special forces operator who had been conducting a multi-year undercover operation. Every conversation they'd had, every quiet moment during long night shifts, had been part of an elaborate performance. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As Sarah continued her slow advance, she began describing the scope of the operation that had brought her to Metropolitan General Hospital. The hospital itself was actually a cover for a federal facility that had been tracking terrorist financing networks. Several of the patients, who had been on the ward for extended periods, were actually undercover agents gathering intelligence on criminal organizations that used medical facilities to launder money. The leader of the attackers finally understood the full scope of how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. His organization hadn't just failed to execute their plan, they had been deliberately led into a trap that would result in the capture of their entire cell. The intelligence they had gathered, the inside contacts they thought they had developed, and the operational security they believed would protect them had all been carefully constructed illusions. In his desperation, the leader made the mistake that Sarah had been waiting for. He stepped out from behind his barricade to get a clearer shot at her, exposing himself for just a moment. But that moment was all Sarah needed. She moved with the same fluid precision that had witnessed throughout the evening, but this final sequence was her masterpiece. Using a piece of portable medical equipment as a launching point, she propelled herself forward with enough momentum to close the 30-foot distance before the terrorist could react. Her approach angle took her below his line of fire, while simultaneously positioning her to strike the pressure points that would instantly disable his arm. The detonator flew from the leader's hand, but Sarah was already moving to secure it before it could hit the ground. Her landing was perfect, rolling through the motion to absorb the impact while maintaining complete control of both the device and her position relative to the remaining 2 attackers. The final 2 men tried to coordinate their response, but they were dealing with someone whose training and experience far exceeded their own. Sarah used their own movements against them, positioning herself so that they couldn't fire without risking hitting each other. When they tried to adjust their positions, she was already moving, using the medical equipment around the ward to create obstacles and confusion. The end came quickly. Sarah's techniques were non-lethal but devastatingly effective. Both men found themselves unconscious and secured before they could mount any meaningful resistance. The leader, partially paralyzed by the precision strikes Sarah had delivered to his nervous system, could only watch as she calmly secured the detonator and began speaking into her communication device. "Control, this is Nightingale. Package secure. All hostiles neutralized. Civilian casualties 0. Medical personnel secure. Request immediate extraction and cleanup crews for evidence preservation." As federal agents began arriving on the ward to secure the scene, found himself staring at Sarah with a mixture of awe and confusion. The woman he had worked alongside for 3 years had just single-handedly defeated a team of professional terrorists using skills that belonged in a Hollywood action movie, not a cardiac care facility. Sarah approached him as the cleanup operation began around them. For the first time since he had known her, she looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. I know this is impossible to process. Everything you thought you knew about me was a cover story. But I need you to understand something important. My respect for you and the work you do here was never fake. The medical knowledge I demonstrated, the care I showed for patients, that was all real. I may have been here for other reasons, but I genuinely came to love this work and the people I worked alongside. Stared at her, trying to reconcile the gentle nurse he had known with the lethal operative he had just witnessed in action. How many of the staff know who you really are? Only the director and the chief of security. Everyone else knows me exactly as you did, as a dedicated cardiac nurse who was perhaps a little too quiet and a little too competent for her own good. Sarah's smile was sad but genuine. I've loved working with you. In another life, under different circumstances, I think we could have been good friends. As the federal agents completed their sweep of the ward and began removing the unconscious terrorists, realized that this night had changed everything. Not just his understanding of Sarah, but his entire perception of the world around him. The quiet hospital where he had worked for over a decade was apparently the center of operations for a sophisticated intelligence network that he never could have imagined. What happens now? He asked as Sarah began gathering her personal belongings from the nurse's station. Now the real Sarah Williams disappears, and Agent returns to whatever assignment comes next. You'll probably get a new nurse on the night shift within a week or two, someone quiet and reliable who won't cause any trouble. She paused, looking around the ward that had been her home for 3 years. But you'll never get another nurse who can handle a situation quite like this one. As Sarah walked toward the elevator with the federal extraction team, found himself thinking about all the quiet moments they had shared during their years working together. Every conversation, every shared cup of coffee, every time she had appeared at exactly the right moment to help with a difficult patient. All of it had been real, even though her identity had been fabricated. The cardiac ward returned to its usual peaceful atmosphere as the morning shift arrived to find no trace of the battle that had taken place just hours before. The patients slept peacefully, unaware that they had been protected by someone whose skills went far beyond anything taught in medical school. Completed his shift reports, but he knew that the official record would never reflect the true events of that extraordinary night. He never saw Sarah again, but sometimes during quiet moments on the night shift, he found himself wondering where Agent was conducting her next undercover operation, and whether the people around her had any idea that their quiet, reliable colleague was actually one of the most dangerous people in the world.